Okay, welcome to Leadership as a Philosophy, Not a Checklist, Chapter 3, Section 3, the archetype. So why are we going to discuss archetypes? Well, I think that the archetypical leaders that have been written down over the past several thousand years of history show us what we're looking for in leaders today, but we've ignored it, or we're not paying attention to it, or we're thinking it's not important. But if it was important enough to be written down and that story kept for thousands of years, maybe we should pay attention to it. The reason I also say archetypical leader is because if we look at what Carl Jung talks about, he suggests that archetypes are in our psyche. And so something in our brains, something deep within us that we don't understand is programmed to recognize archetypes. So just think for yourself. Who would you follow? You're not going to follow somebody, when I say follow, willfully follow somebody who just happens to be in charge. Because sometimes those people in charge, the only reason that you tolerate them is because you're getting paid to. But who would you voluntarily follow? Well, somebody who takes care of you, somebody who makes you feel important at the job that you're doing, somebody who tells the truth, and then somebody who's paying attention to all the stuff that's going on. Because you're sitting there doing your job, you got to have somebody who's watching other stuff. Well, that's sort of the archetypical leader from thousands of years ago. And I'm going to hopefully show that evidence. So it's not some sort of a mystical, magical, weird, big word formula that makes somebody a leader, but it's behaviors and activities and what that person represents. So I myself, if somebody's making sound decisions, paying attention to stuff, is having some empathy and a little bit of, I'm not the most important person on the planet, I'll listen to what they say. I'll follow them just because that person's going to do the right thing. But you get somebody who's a tyrant, then I'm not interested in following that person. So that's one of the split things about leaders, right? I've said it before, say it again. Leadership is a talent, but then it has to be tempered by a philosophy. So the philosophy will be the chapter section 6, but we're going to talk about the archetypical ideal leader. And the reason I say that is because we have examples of the ideal that have lasted longer than examples of the bad. I'll give some examples. Anyway, kind of a short one this time, and only one slide in the archetype section. And once again, this is a suggestion. These are not my ideas. This is me looking at the evidence and coming up with suggestions. So if you've got something better, I really hope that this leads to some conversations. But that's what we're going to do. So next will be the classroom portion, which, it's my office. All right, thanks for your time. Alrighty, welcome to the classroom portion of the archetype. So just to make sure that I have a little bit of a caveat at the beginning of this, I'm not an expert in any of these religions that I'm going to talk about or any of these things that I'm going to talk about. However, if you look at the stories, look at the example, look at the archetype that's represented, that's what I'm after. So I'm going to go through these things. Some of the stories are a little bit different depending on which source you look at, so I tried to glean the pattern after which everything else is established, if that makes any sense. So, first of all, we will start off with Mardik. Now, once again, I learned about Mardik by reading Maps of Meaning with Jordan Peterson, and this was probably the time that my eyes were opened and I thought it was hilarious that I had been missing this for so many years. So this is one of the oldest written stories. Well, it is the oldest written story that we know of, which means that it could have been going on for hundreds, thousands of years before. And they estimate that this thing is 5,000 years old. So back then, the story really quick of what happened with Mardik in Mesopotamia is there was a whole pantheon of gods, bigger gods. Some of the younger gods had a little revolution and killed one of the older gods, caused a bunch of problems. So Tiamat, or Apsu, and Tiamat decided that they were going to go destroy all of the younger gods. Now, let's think about what a god represents 5,000 years ago. Something that we understand about ourselves, suddenly we make a god out of it. So the god of love, god of war, god of sun, god of... So all these gods were fighting Tiamat and couldn't win. So suddenly Mardik appears. Well, Mardik, nobody knows anything about. I don't even know what he was the god of. But suddenly here comes this god that says, I will go fight the dragon of chaos for you, but you got to follow me. So all of his gods say, sure, go ahead. Mardik goes off, fights Tiamat, kills her, and then ends up being in charge of Mesopotamia. And then all of the rulers, the people that were in charge of the Mesopotamian people at that time, were all called Mardik. Now, what's interesting about this is this goes back to my thing about leadership being a talent. So here's this god of, we don't know what, some minor god, and he shows up out of nowhere and is able to confront chaos. So you've got all these other gods that are experts in their field, if you want to say, and they're unable to do anything about it, but here comes this guy, and he goes off and takes everything out. Now, Mardik is represented this way in this picture, but he's also described as having eyes all around his head so he can see everywhere, speaks magic words, which I like to think is the truth, and has the integrity to go off and confront chaos. So you have to have a god that is able to do those things. Now, I'm not saying that leaders are gods, but that's the description of who the Mesopotamians decided that they were going to follow. So what we derive from that is paying attention, speaking magic words, which would be the truth, and being able to confront chaos. Okay. And then also, something that I learned later on was that the rulers of Mesopotamia every year had to go outside of the city and take off all of their robes, so they were just a common person, and then describe to everybody why they had not been a good Mardik that year. And if they did a good enough job and the people were okay with that, they would let him, or let that ruler be in charge again for the next year. So I think that's a great model, which we'll talk about in the solution chapter. So the next story, Osiris, Horus, and Set. So Cyrus and Horus. So Cyrus's old king became complacent, stopped paying attention to things, started having a little bit too much hubris, started fooling around with different women or goddesses. And then his brother Set fooled him, put him in a coffin, and killed him. So then Horus was the son of Osiris, or one of the sons, and he decides that he's going to go off and confront Set. Has this big long fight, loses an eye, but he gets Osiris back. And then together, Osiris rules the underworld and Horus rules the living world. And then his eye represents the pharaoh at the time. So here we go again with the same theme. Paying attention. Also looking after hierarchies. Remember, we're going to talk about in the hierarchy section about how hierarchies become complacent and stale if you're not watching them. And so that's talked about here with this story. And then also you need the old and you need the new to go ahead and be in charge, to be the ruler. And so the all-seeing eye is a function of being a leader, but it's also being able to go and confront chaos. So going and fighting the king of the underworld is not a cool thing. And so that's the next theme. But still, again, we got paying attention, confronting, the ability to confront chaos, and well, humility not so much in this one. So next, this one is going to cause a little bit of a stir because this might be a little bit longer than everything else. So the Tao Te Ching and Lao Tzu. I put down maybe because there's a whole bunch of debate about it. At the end of the day, I'm not that concerned about whether or not Lao Tzu wrote it, because if you look it up, they say the old master wrote this. Okay, it's not that important. What's important is the wisdom. And so in the Tao Te Ching, all of these sections, I don't know what to call them. Every time I look it up, I get some different answer. Represent leadership. So I'm going to read them relatively quickly. So number 7, and these are all things that were written, as far as we can tell, 2,600 years ago. So 400 BC, 500 BC, or, it's all debated, but still a couple thousand years ago. So when the master governs, the people hardly are aware that he exists. The next best is a leader who is loved, next one who is feared, the worst one who is despised. If you don't trust the people, you make them untrustworthy. The master doesn't talk, he acts. When his work is done, people say, amazing, we did it by ourselves. That's number 17. Number 57. If you want to be a great leader, you must learn to follow the Dao. So the Taoism is a big deal. Stop trying to control, let go of fixed plans and concepts, and the world will govern itself. The more prohibitions you have, the less virtuous people will be. The more weapons you have, the less secure people will be. The more subsidies you have, the less self-reliant people will be. Therefore, the master says, if I let go of the law, people become honest. Let go of economics and people become prosperous. Let go of religion and people become serene. Let go of all desire for the common good, and the common good becomes common as grass. So that's, don't be heavy-handed with your leadership, but that's also describing a big philosophical thing. Number 58, if a country is governed with tolerance, the people are comfortable and honest. If a country is governed with repression, the people are despised and crafty, or depressed and crafty. When the will to power is in charge, the higher the ideals, the lower the results. That's a great point. Try to make people happy, and you lay the groundwork for misery. Try to make people moral, you lay the groundwork for vice. Thus, the master is content to serve as an example and not impose her will. She is pointed, doesn't pierce, straightforward, but supple, radiant, but easy on the eyes. Well, just think about it. That's describing who you want to be in charge, right? Number 59, for governing a country well, there is nothing better than moderation. The mark of a moderate man is freedom from his own ideas. Tolerant like the sky, all-pervading like sunlight, firm like a mountain, supple like a tree in the wind. He has no destination in view and uses whatever life brings his way. Nothing is impossible for him because he has let go and can care for the people's welfare as a mother cares for a child. So look, don't try to be perfect. Try to take care of your people, make sure that your organization's working. Number 60, love this one. Because think about how many times in your specific organization this has happened. Governing a large country is like frying a small fish. You spoil it with too much poking. Center your country in the Tao, and evil will have no power. Not that it isn't there, but you will be able to step out of its way. Give evil nothing to oppose, and it will disappear by itself. So I look at that one, center your country in the Tao. Well, center your country in a philosophy. Center your country as your organization. Have a philosophy, get the organization set on an ideal philosophy, and it'll be able to withstand all the chaos that it's going through. Number 61, when a country obtains great power, or organization, or person, it becomes like the sea, all streams run toward it. The more powerful it grows, the greater need for humility. Humility means trusting the Tao, thus never needing to be defensive. Great nation is like a great man. When he makes a mistake, he realizes it. Having realized it, he admits it. Having admitted it, he corrects it. He considers those who point out his fault as the most benevolent teachers. He sees the enemy as the shadow and that he himself casts. If a nation is centered in the Tao, if it nourishes its own people and doesn't meddle in the affairs of others, it will be a light to all nations in the world. Okay, so, you notice something that's kind of starting to come out here. Have integrity, have humility, have empathy. So number 66 is kind of the same idea. All streams flow to the sea because it is lower than they are. Humility gives it power. If you want to govern the people, you must put yourself below them. If you want to lead the people, you must learn how to follow them. The master is above the people and no one feels oppressed. She goes ahead of the people and no one feels manipulated. The whole world is grateful to her because she competes with no one and no one can compete with her. So big emphasis on humility throughout this entire thing, but also having empathy for the people, not being a tyrant. And then the last one, and I just love this one. Oh, I love all of them. Men are born soft and supple, dead they are stiff and hard. Plants are born tender and pliant, dead they are brittle and dry. Thus whoever is stiff and inflexible is a disciple of death. Whoever is soft and yielding is a disciple of life. The hard and stiff will be broken, the soft and supple will prevail. So we're going to talk about this a lot in the hierarchy chapters, where if you let your organization become too entrenched in a bureaucracy and nothing is going to change, the environment changes, your organization is going to fail. So if you're able to change and adapt and be a little bit more flexible, it's going to be a beautiful thing. And this is written 2,500 years ago. To me, these are leadership quotes. Now, understanding that the Chinese that was written 2,500 years ago is different, so some of this translation's weird. I will look up the translation for this. I think that I have it written down. Let me see. I think I wrote it down. Yeah, I didn't write it down, but I will look up the definite or the translation that I used. But the wisdom is still correct. All right, last, we're just going to do 4 is Moses. So Moses is another example of a leader back in history. So Moses didn't want to be a leader. God stepped down or God asked him to be the leader, and Moses didn't want to do it. So go find somebody else, please. I don't want this job. And then he went through several times, going through and doing all this stuff. For those of you that don't know the story of Moses, I encourage you to go read these stories yourself. They're all half an hour to 45 minutes long, and then the discussion on them could go on for days. But Moses was in charge. He didn't want the job, but he took the job. And then a couple of different times he argued with God to try to defend the Hebrews, but then went and found out they were doing wrong, and then he went ham on them, which is a sign of a good leader. So you don't punish my people, I punish my people. And if you go and look, it's sort of funny to read the story now that we're talking about this. Once you've read or listened to all these different things, you see a great allegory between Moses and the Israelites or the Hebrews and a leader in an organization. Because there's plenty of times where the Israelites were given lots of things and still complained. It still happens in organizations. But Moses, we talk about Moses, the most humble man, the world's greatest, the most important Jewish person. But if you go through these stories, which are between thousands of years old, we're not sure how old they are. Trying to put a specific date is complicated. But if you look at all of them, it's paying attention, it's being humble, it's having empathy, which means taking care of people, but also having empathy for the situation. So you take all 4 of those things. And then integrity, right? Keeping your word, all that sort of stuff. So these are archetypical stories that I believe describe leadership from thousands of years ago. Now, the word leadership didn't exist until 500 years ago, but they were describing that person. This is the archetype. This is the example of what people will follow. I'll follow somebody who's going to be humble, but what's the one thing that you also have to see? And that's why I use the word vigilance. So all these people were humble, paying attention, having empathy, but they still had to do stuff. So they were still doing their job. It's not that they weren't important. They were paying attention to everybody else too. So my take on the archetype, and like I said, think about this a little bit. This is from thousands of years ago. I just gave you examples, and it sounds like I'm doing a leadership course today. So it's not like the stuff that's going on now has never happened before. I think that we are not paying attention to these examples and saying, well, that's what we're looking for in a leader, right? So I think that there is an archetype. And then that archetype, we have an archetype that governs, that's good, and an archetype that covers tyrants, but we don't need tyrants because everybody can immediately think of a terrible leader. All right, so that's it. Thank you so much for paying attention. The next one is going to be talking about hierarchies, which you'll see the problems with hierarchies will be tied up in some of these things from thousands of years ago. Thank you so much for your time.